Hello and welcome to the first in a series of webinars on laboratory accreditation. My name is Ned Gravel, and today we're going to talk about accreditation in general. This webinar was written and produced by Motiva Training Inc., and it is sponsored by the Laboratory Accreditation Bureau. Their website is listed at the top left of every slide in the presentation. Today we're going to go over the highlights of accreditation, how it works, how it's supposed to help you in your laboratories, and what it will cost you to implement. Let's first examine how accreditation fits into our various industries. Suppliers provide goods and services, hopefully conforming to the requirements of their customers and to the regulations. For many products and services, determining conformity is a difficult task requiring specialist conformity assessment bodies. Obviously, customers want assurance of the competence of the conformity assessment bodies to avoid the risk of receiving bad data leading to bad decisions, or bad data leading to bad products. And this is where accreditation bodies come in. They're there to transparently and objectively identify competent conformity assessment bodies in order to satisfy the demand for formal assurance of competence. Now, however, each conformity assessment requirement, including accreditation, can be deemed an impediment to trade. Imposing such requirements presupposes that a sophisticated technical infrastructure exists in each nation. So how do we overcome these impediments, which in some cases are considered technical barriers to trade themselves, and in violation of the World Trade Organization's TBT Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement? The only reasonable and cost-effective solution to this is an open, effective, and transparent method for the mutual recognition of the demonstrated competence of these conformity assessment bodies, so that internationally accepted recognition is available everywhere. And this is where the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation comes in. ILAC is an international organization that formally recognizes the equivalence of accreditations between signatories. The Laboratory Accreditation Bureau, LAB, is an ILAC signatory body. So much for the benefits to others. Now let's talk about the benefits to ourselves. First, let's talk about what accreditation is and what it is not. Accreditation is only formal recognition of demonstrated competence. In this case, we're talking about competence in testing and calibration. Accreditation also applies to demonstrated competence in other disciplines, such as the certification of persons, or management systems, or products, or the inspection of processes and installations. In all cases, the accreditation is based on an assessment of the competence of the organization being accredited, and the assessment is conducted by technically competent peers. In terms of the laboratory itself, if we can recall the non-assuming manner of the man in this picture, we can see that the heart of competence in testing and calibration is really the ability to produce consistent, technically valid results. That's the only thing that counts in the accreditation of a testing or calibration laboratory, and that is exactly what ISO IEC 17025, the standard used by these organizations, is aimed at. Thinking as a laboratory person, our professional views are based on our experience in our science and technical disciplines, and these views are not necessarily shared by our customers or the regulators that provide structure in our industries. They want the truth from us, and they want our results to be correct. That we are competent or follow a standard is of secondary importance to them. So accreditation is a means to allow a single process to create trust in the minds of consumers and regulators with regard to the competence of an organization and its people in the production of testing and calibration results. This is what accreditation bodies do, and they have their own set of hoops to jump through to be deemed acceptable to regulators, other accreditation bodies, and the public. In other words, who accredits the accreditors? Well, that organization is ILAC. While its members are almost all accreditation bodies, make no mistake about a potential for conflict of interest. There are over 70 signatories representing more than 60 nations. Most of them are concerned with the protection of the health, welfare, and safety of the citizens of their own jurisdictions. And this demanding approach is the basis for the acceptance of accreditation bodies into the international group. This slide shows the basic components of competence in a laboratory. They come from the first principle behind the Laboratory Competence Standard, ISO IEC 17025, and that principle is called capacity. And the actual components of capacity are exactly as written here. Note how ISO 9001 allows three sources for the definitions of competence or conformance to be demonstrated by the organization: itself, their client, or some third-party specification. Not so for 17025. Only the third-party specification counts. And it will contain all the requirements for the laboratory to understand what the competence requirements are for that specific test or calibration. As well, during an assessment, the assessor, who is an expert in that science, will represent that third-party specification to the laboratory to ensure that the laboratory is demonstrating competence in the conduct of the test or calibration. In order to get accredited, a laboratory will have to undergo initial and ongoing demonstration of the things shown here. As well, the laboratory will have to continue to demonstrate these things for as long as it wishes to retain its accreditation. If we examine these processes from the point of view of the accreditation body, and even if we consider them to be only a service provider to the laboratory, they will need some things to ethically recommend and determine the laboratory conformant to the requirements and capable of producing technically valid results for these tests and calibrations. What the accreditation body will need primarily is the evidence that the laboratory can produce technically valid and competent results for these tests and calibrations and do so consistently. But let's remember that accreditation is not an assurance of freedom from error. Because the accreditation is formal recognition of competence that was demonstrated during an assessment, which is by definition a snapshot in time, it cannot guarantee that the lab will not ever make an error. It will guarantee, however, that the laboratory has conformant processes in place to handle mistakes and errors, and that they can respond appropriately when something goes wrong. And this is what sometimes happens when a laboratory has finally decided to go get accreditation. It can be closer to the truth than we are willing to admit from time to time. However, all the adverse stages should be avoided. And in the end, the assessment should actually consist of a technical discussion between peers about a list of things to do. There will always be a list, but it should be developed between the technically competent peers, those who work in the laboratory and those on the assessment team. Almost all ILAC-recognized accreditation bodies use assessment processes which are similar to the ones shown here. It is not sufficient for a laboratory to simply create a quality manual and submit it for review. Laboratory testing and calibration methods must be validated, and they must have evidence of that on file. The technical procedures must all be written, and proficiency testing results must indicate proficiency for those tests and calibrations. Both an internal audit and a management review must have been conducted, or the assessors will not have the evidence that the lab is maintaining their quality system. And once the assessment is over and the lab has responded to the findings, then the approval process can begin, resulting in the issuance of the Certificate of Accreditation. An assessment is not the first stage in obtaining accreditation, nor is it the last, but it is the single most important event in the entire process. If it is done well, an assessment team can walk out of a laboratory having left over 80 findings behind, and the laboratory was glad they came. Sound impossible? Not so. It has happened. In most instances, assessments will produce significantly fewer findings than this. An assessment is the single least expensive technical symposium that all members of the lab and the assessment team will ever attend together. Done properly, an assessment is a technical discussion between technically competent peers about a list of things to do. During an assessment, the assessors will need to see records that provide evidence of the competence of the people doing the testing and calibration work in the laboratory. The left side of this slide lists those things that are not part of such an examination. These things are confidential between the laboratory and its employees. The right side lists those things which must be available for examination. So who are these accreditation body assessors, and where do they come from? Well, they're folks just like the technical staff in the laboratory. They come from laboratories. They are part of the industry, and they know the tests they are assessing. They've been trained to deliver conformant assessments without scaring the living daylights out of the lab staff, and they should be able to write comprehensive, objective, and impartial assessment reports. The certificate of accreditation is not the end of the work within a laboratory. In fact, it can often be considered a new beginning. Maintaining accreditation takes work, and the laboratory must continue to maintain and operate its quality system. This includes continued participation in proficiency testing, conducting internal audits, holding management reviews, identifying and addressing non-conformances, potential non-conformances, and opportunities for improvement through to corrective or preventive action, all as required. The laboratory may add or take tests away from its scope, but adding may require another assessment visit. Any indications that the lab is having difficulty may result in a visit by the assessment team again, but this time for cause. Proficiency testing should be available from accredited proficiency testing providers. In some cases, it is not. Accreditation bodies will normally keep a list of approved providers for use by the laboratory. Participation, however, is mandatory. Successful participation is required for laboratories to maintain their accreditation. Through the duration of the accreditation, a lab may wish to add more tests or calibrations to their scope of accreditation. Adding new tests to a scope of accreditation will normally require the things listed here. Some of them will depend on the complexity of the test and the laboratory's performance in similar testing disciplines. Adding new tests to a scope of accreditation may, or it may not, require a site visit by an assessment team. Here are some of the more difficult concepts that face laboratories in acquiring and maintaining accreditation. They will all be covered in detail in a later webinar, but for today we will cover these basics. First, accuracy and trueness are both defined internationally as being qualitative concepts. They cannot be expressed using numbers. However, precision and uncertainty can. The most important concept here, however, is traceability, and it's associated with the results produced by a lab. Traceability supports technical validity. Traceability requires uncertainties to be estimated for all associated calibrations and tests, and the uncertainties must be estimated at each of these steps. Whenever one of these of either traceability or calibration or uncertainty is missing from any one of the steps in the traceability chain, none of them can exist below that point in the chain. One of the difficulties facing labs that seek accreditation is the rationale behind the concept of uncertainty. Well, the fact is that besides being a measure of the quality of a test or calibration result, uncertainty is also a tool the laboratory can use to identify areas where technical processes need work. When the uncertainty of a test result is relatively small, it means that the laboratory has good control over its testing processes. When it is large, there is less control. An accredited testing laboratory is not always required to report uncertainties with its measurements, but it must always estimate them. A calibration laboratory must normally always report their uncertainties. Unless the result is a calibration, reporting uncertainties is only going to be required when it's asked for by the customer, or when the test result approaches a legal or specification limit, or when it is needed to determine the validity of the test. For example, if a test result is 12 but the uncertainty is 25, then that test is not really useful. So let's spend a few moments talking about the heart of the laboratory's quality system, those tools which really help it to ensure that they are producing only technically valid results. And basically it comes down to the ability of the laboratory to identify those issues that impede their production of technically valid results and how to treat them. In this case here, on this slide, the issue has already been identified as having caused a problem. That is to say, it occurred in the past. If the issue is deemed to need permanent resolution, then corrective action, starting with root cause analysis, will be implemented. In this second case, the issue is a forward-looking issue in the future. The issue may either cause a problem, or it may in fact result in improvement of one of the processes for the laboratory. If the issue is deemed to need permanent addressing or resolution, then preventive action, again starting with root cause analysis, will be implemented. So where do we find the things that need to be identified and, if necessary, addressed? Well, In this diagram at the top, you can see the clauses in 17025, the Laboratory Quality System Standard, that tell us where to look for issues that give us or could give us grief or could even be improved upon. The left side of the slide is about those things that have already gone wrong and could result in corrective action if their permanent resolution is deemed required. The right side is about those things which might go wrong or could be improved upon and could result in preventive action. When it is all put together, this whole approach is called continual improvement. It is a holistic approach to having our quality system work for us instead of us working for it. The procedure can be one procedure with the same forms and approaches used for both corrective and preventive action. The topic of continual improvement will be the basis of a separate webinar. In the end, these are the indicators that a laboratory continual improvement program is working well. To this point, we have looked at the processes involved in accreditation. Now let's look at the benefits and the costs. Here we can start with the benefits. This is the most telling benefit to the laboratory. From the results of studies ongoing since 1997, in life science laboratories, those that are accredited will produce 10 to 20% more precise results and have 10 to 20% fewer PT failures. If this is important to a laboratory, then accreditation is of benefit to you. Now let's look at the costs of accreditation. 95% of the work to acquire accreditation will not be done by the accreditation body. It will be done by the lab. As well, 95% of the cost of accreditation is not in the fees paid to the accreditation body. It is in the staff time and expense to build and maintain the system that will support the lab's ability to produce technically valid results. This is the start point for the laboratory's work in preparing for the acquisition of accreditation. Without visible, continuing, and demonstrable commitment and support from top management, the effort will produce lukewarm results at best and will eventually adversely affect the ability of the laboratory to produce technically valid results. There are a lot of variables in determining the amount of effort and cost needed to build a quality system for a laboratory. For a laboratory that has about 20 people, consider the allocation of one full-time person to build a system and about 10 to 15% of the time of everyone else to help in the creation of the technical procedures. This is not a hard and fast rule, but it is about how it has worked for others. Building and implementing the quality system is going to be the hard part. Training is easy. But training on how to do this should come first. Those folks can then train others in the operation of the system. Before any assessment can take place, the laboratory must have validated all of its methods and tests it wished to have assessed, and it must have completed one internal audit and a management review. As well, the continual improvement program should be up and working by the time the assessment takes place. When everything is built and the lab is ready, it's time to apply for accreditation. That's when the assessors will be there. Their job is to walk through the lab processes with the staff so that they can document the demonstrated competence of the lab. They're looking for evidence of conformance. They're not there trying to cite deficiencies. However, when an issue is identified, there will be discussion, and there will always be issues that are identified. As in all things associated with conformity assessment, the more information, the more findings, the better. Internal audits and external assessments that produce more findings give us a much better picture of our systems. If we spend our time trying to only reduce them, we will send the wrong messages to our staff. A good system is a transparent one. Once the assessment report is written, the accreditation body in the lab must come to consensus on the appropriateness of the lab responses to the findings. All accreditation bodies have groups and committees that deal with disagreements on the nature of the responses, and this only enhances the technical integrity of the accreditation. Eventually, a decision is made and a certificate is issued. During this webinar, we have seen what accreditation is, why it's important, how it works, what its benefits and costs are. So now let's look at the end result. This slide shows a description of a perfect lab. Under ISO IEC 17025, a lab that can produce this level of consistency is doing exactly the right things. If you wish more information, please contact Pat Douglas at the Laboratory Accreditation Bureau. Thank you for your time.